English translation 490th contact. Saturday, 20th of March 2010, 2:31 hours.
Greetings, dear friend Edward. You have been waiting for me.
Welcome and greetings also, my friend. I will be in my office as soon as I have finished correcting this, so I am here already. Actually, I thought you would get here before me.
I talked to Florina and Enjana for a little while, so I came a little later.
Understood. But may I inquire about your condition?
You may, my friend, and I may tell you that I have recovered after the conversations with you. It is amazing that I am allowed to say this, because in previous events of the same kind, I had much more trouble to process and cope with everything. I actually had to get old enough to be able to deal with such events in just 20 days to the extent that I can be happy again. I used to need many weeks for that.
Your old age certainly also plays a few important roles in this. Normally, knowledge and wisdom increase with age. And you with 790 years.
3 more years, if I may request.
Naturally, we older geezers count the individual years. Does that seem important to us?
It is probably not important, because the remark is only meant for correctness.
It was also not meant seriously. But look here, it is something written for you. Oh, it is sealed. I had not noticed. You will have to open it first.
But you know that I do not accept letters.
Yes, it is not just a letter. It is also something from all of us, I mean from us core group members, with which we want to tell you something.
I did not know that...
Ptah opens the envelope and reads,
Ah, these words and the names please me very much, for which I thank you worthily, also in the name of my daughters Simya, Se, and Pleja, because the kind words are also addressed to them. My dear, thanks for this for me and my daughter's very dear sympathy in our suffering. The words move me deeply and show me all your solidarity with my daughters and me. Thanks. Thank you all very much.
We all feel deeply connected to you and Simya, Se, and Pleja. We all felt the need for you to read the lines Bridget wrote for the core group members.
My 2 daughters will also be pleased about this. Thank you.
Please give my love to both of them. But see here, Bernadette wrote this letter to Mr. Westerwell in Germany regarding the German language, because this man is also committed to the idea that German should be spread worldwide. The following is an article by a Dr. Senf, who wrote something about the population explosion. Shall I read it to you?
No, I will read it myself.
Historical Roots of the Population Explosion from the book by Bernd Senf, Die Wiederentdeckung des Lebendigen, Omega Verlag, www. Omega Verlag. De Bernd Senf, Bernd Senf. De.
I would like to refer to another problem related to underdevelopment, misery, hunger and violence, which has escalated and continues to escalate, and has contributed and continues to contribute significantly to the burial of the living, the population explosion. If we compare the accelerated growth of the world's population with other growth processes that occur in nature, we must conclude that it is completely unnatural growth. Everywhere in nature, growth processes take place organically. A single organism, including us human beings, initially grows with accelerated exponential growth. A fertilized egg cell becomes 2 cells through cell division, and then 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. But this exponential growth does not and cannot go on indefinitely, and is also unable to do so, but instead enters a phase of weakened, slowing growth until a saturation point is reached. When this limit is reached, the organism is grown up, and changes take place only in qualitative terms. The organism matures and ages. If a single organism were to continue to grow exponentially, it would increasingly crush and eventually destroy the larger living system of which it is only a part. We know this kind of growth within the human organism as cancer. Now, however, a whole biological species, for example an animal species or a plant species, has by nature the possibility of exponential growth of its population, the number of its specimens. If, in the case of sexual reproduction from two parents, more than two offspring children, grandchildren, etc., on average emerge from two parents and survive, the population of this biological species grows if other influencing variables, for example average life expectancy, remain the same. A population that continues to grow and thus becomes increasingly out of balance with other species in its environment and with the environment as a whole is called a pest. In the case of plants, this is referred to as weeds. These terms do not refer to the individual specimen. It can be a useful animal or, for example, a medicinal plant. A species only becomes a pest or weed when it is no longer in balance with the ecological system as a whole. Incidentally, many species have only become pests or weeds because human beings, with their way of life and technology, have thoughtlessly interfered with nature and destroyed the existing ecological balance. For example, by reducing or exterminating an animal species, which in turn feeds on another species and thus naturally keeps its growth under control. So wherever exponential growth occurs, it is something unnatural, pathological, destructive. Cancer, pests, weeds. According to exactly these standards, humanity with its exponential population growth, which has now turned into a population explosion, is a pest, or a tumor on the organism Earth. Has this kind of population growth always existed? And has it only become so acute in recent decades? Or was there previously a population development in harmony with nature, that is to say with other species and with the environment as a whole? And if so, has there historically been something like an initial spark that caused the population development to explode? The answer, which is explained below, is yes. The initial spark of the population explosion did not occur in today's Third World, but in Central Europe, and from there, in the course of colonialism, it spread like a chain reaction to today's Third World.
The role of witch hunting.
The main historical roots of the population explosion were not primarily, as is so often claimed, advances in modern medicine and hygiene, but the systematic eradication of women's originally widespread knowledge of natural contraception and the systematic channeling of sexuality for the purpose of reproducing human beings, while at the same time demonizing all forms of lust-oriented sexuality that do not lead to procreation. The originator of this systematic breeding program was the Church, and the essential means of its implementation was the persecution of witches, the destruction of the wise women. This is the title of a book by Gunnar Heinsohn and Otto Steiger, to which I will refer repeatedly in the following.
The destruction of the knowledge of life energy.
The witches of earlier centuries were not the evil, hunchbacked old women with a cat on their shoulder and practicing evil spells as they are told in many fairy tales. Rather, they were wise women with a great deal of knowledge about health, illness, and healing, as well as about questions of sexuality, contraception, pregnancy, and birth. They were the bearers of a folk medicine based on natural healing methods, including life-energetic methods and their affirmation of life and the emphasis on pleasure, were also expressed in their ecstatic rituals and celebrations coven. The witches felt connected to the flowing life energy within themselves, often had a strong sexual charisma, could connect with the cosmic energy which they called the Great Goddess, could let this energy flow through them and have a healing effect on others. They lived a form of spirituality that had not been possible in the frozen and male-dominated structures of the Church for centuries. The transmission or application of all this wisdom enabled women to decide about their bodies, about procreation, about pregnancy and birth, and to conceive or bear children only when they also wanted to. And the will to do so also depended on whether the child could be expected to have a sufficient material basis of existence and a life worthy of human beings. If there were no prospects in this respect, but only hunger, poverty, exploitation, oppression, then the women had little motivation to bring children into the world. And the witches knew how to prevent or avoid this when it was not desired. So there was knowledge, spread all over the world, by the way, of the effectiveness of certain plants which, for example, processed into tea and administered to women, prevented conception for several years. De Meo has also compiled interesting historical and ethnological material on this subject. In this way, women were able to live out their sexuality without the constant fear of unwanted pregnancy. In Europe, this knowledge had already been taboo in the Middle Ages under the influence of the Church and had been pushed underground, where it was guarded by witches and passed on to other women again and again. What interest did the Church have in finally eradicating this knowledge completely? It was both an economic and a sexual economic interest, and with the persecution and extermination of the witches, the Church killed two birds with one stone, so to speak.
The destruction of contraceptive knowledge as a means of human production.
The beginning of the systematic witch hunt does not coincide with a time when the population in Europe shrank dramatically due to climate-related famines, devastating economic crises, and the Great Plague in the middle of the 14th century. In some areas, 70% of the population had been wiped out. The average in Europe is estimated at around 50%. As a result, the number of serf farmers and the additional product they produced, the basis for the levy on the feudal lords, had also fallen dramatically, and with it, the source of wealth for the nobility. In some places, this source of wealth threatened to dry up completely, and this also caused the basis of the social power and rule of the nobility to falter more and more. On the one hand, the nobility tried to reduce their loss of wealth by increasing taxes and pressure on the peasants in bondage. On the other hand, this was precisely what provoked more and more resistance on the part of the peasants, which resulted in peasant revolts. Under such devastating economic circumstances, rural women were less and less inclined to give birth to children. Now, the biggest landowner at that time was the Church, which saw its economic power dwindling more and more. Large landowners without a rural population who work the land as serfs no longer produce wealth. So the Church superiors came up with a strategy of how they could get or force women to give birth to as many children as possible in order to produce population growth and regenerate the source of exploitation of human labor in the countryside.
The reduction of sexuality to human breeding.
From these considerations, the so-called Witches' Bull of Pope Innocent VIII, the canonical legal basis for the persecution of witches, was created in 1484. It was followed in 1487 by the official legal commentary of the Witch Bull, the so-called Witch Hammer, of the two Dominican friars Sprenger and Institoris. From both documents, the direction and the actual purpose of the witch hunt are unmistakable. They are directed directly against all knowledge and abilities of witches in the field of contraception and abortion, as well as lust-oriented sexuality. The application and passing on of such knowledge was criminalized and punished with death. The destruction of contraceptive knowledge alone would not have guaranteed stronger offspring. To achieve this goal, sexuality in its manifold forms of expression and experience was also reduced to heterosexual intercourse between spouses. All other forms of sexuality that did not lead to the breeding of offspring were declared fornication and also punishable by death. The corresponding laws were later also adopted by the state, that is to say, by the emperor, and with the expansion of his dominion, the persecution of witches then spread throughout Europe. That the feudal state had the same interest as the church in this respect is evident from the above. But also with the dissolution of feudalism and the development of capitalism, the new ruling class, the bourgeoisie, initially had a great interest in a growing population. In order to create a growing number of wage earners with correspondingly falling wages, as well as a growing number of cheap soldiers for their colonial conquests. Even the Church Reformation, which worked towards a greater secularization of the faith, and criticized and fought against many abuses of power by the Catholic Church, agreed with the Pope on the issue of witch hunting, and under Luther did not distance itself from this mass murder of women, but supported it. In this respect, not only the path of the Catholic, but also that of the Protestant Church, as far as the persecution of witches is concerned, is marked with traces of blood. Both churches have not yet come to terms with this dark chapter in their history, nor have they officially admitted it, let alone apologized for even one of these millions of murders. After all, it took the Catholic Church 350 years to officially admit its error about Galileo, to admit that not the Inquisition, but Galileo was right in his assertion that the earth revolves around the sun and is not the center of the world. How long do you think it will take until the churches will admit their guilt about the Holocaust to the witches, and until they will be officially rehabilitated?
Church Inquisition, torture and mass murder.
To convict the witches for their alleged crimes, they first had to be identified as witches. Accordingly, the Inquisition sent an army of men across the country who called on the population to spy and denounce them, and paid a bounty for every report of a witch. The denunciation of women as alleged witches thus became a flourishing business for many. If the alleged witches were wealthy themselves, it also became a business for the church, because the assets of these women were confiscated. In order to denounce a woman as a witch, the slightest suspicion or even malice on the part of the denunciators was enough. The Inquisition then checked by means of witch tests whether the suspicion was justified. A witch test, for example, consisted of examining the women for so-called devil marks. It was assumed that witches could only practice their craft in covenant with the devil and had a sexual relationship with the devil, which must have left its mark on a devil's mark. If a devil's mark, similar to a birthmark, was not visible at first sight, the woman had to expose herself bit by bit before the eyes of the inquisitor. If there was still not a mark, the hair was gradually shaved off, the hair on the head, the hair in the armpits, and finally also the pubic hair. If there was still no sign of the devil, the vagina was palpated. And if this also did not give a reliable result, the nail test or the water test followed. In the acid test, the woman's body was punctured 100 times with long nails, and it was assumed that an inner devil mark was characterized by the fact that it did not react to a puncture with pain or bleeding. Once such a mark had been found, and it exists in every body, the woman was convicted as a witch and was publicly burned at the stake. The water test consisted of the suspected woman being tied by her arms and legs and then thrown into the water. A witch was believed to be able to free herself from her bonds in covenant with the devil and through supernatural powers. So women who could somehow free themselves from their fetters were thus convicted as witches and were burned. The others who did not succeed were not convicted, but drowned. Death by burning or drowning, these were the alternatives for women who had been denounced by others and suspected as witches because of the hunt for the bounty or for any other base motives. In doubt against the accused was the motto, and in any case, the surefire witch test removed any doubt. For the inquisitors, who were themselves subject to celibacy, the witch trials were a welcome outlet for their pent-up and sadistically perverted sexuality. The public burning of witches had a similar function for the masses. For the more the witch hunts condemned lustful sexuality as fornication and punished with death, the more a climate of sexual hostility and sexual fear spread, which dammed up sexual energies and could only find its outlet in destructive discharge. In this respect, the public burning of witches also fulfilled an important mass psychological function. Another aspect of witch persecution was the torture of the alleged witches in order to obtain a confession from them and to force them to denounce other women. In torture chambers, their limbs were torn apart and torn from their bodies, and other cruelties were committed against them until they were tortured to death. On the bodies torn apart and cut open in such a way, one could now study how the human body is constructed from the inside. This was the beginning of anatomy, one of the foundations of modern medicine. In the course of the emerging mechanistic worldview, one sought access to the understanding of illness and health by dismembering and cutting up the body. Somewhere the disease had to be located, somewhere an organ or tissue had to be changed compared to the healthy state of an organism.
Burning of witches and the destruction of popular medicine.
After the witches' wisdom and knowledge of the functions of sexuality and life energy, and the energetic methods of prevention and healing derived from them had been eradicated, it was no longer possible to imagine a life-energetic understanding of illness, health, and healing at all. In accordance with the mechanistic understanding of nature, they looked for any parts that were no longer intact and, like a broken machine, needed to be repaired, or for material pathogens as the alleged sole cause of the disease, which then had to be identified, fought, and killed. The catastrophic state of health of the population, which was reflected among other things in high numbers of fatal pregnancies and stillbirths, as well as increased infant mortality, was to a large extent only the consequence of the preceding destruction of folk medicine, the carriers of which had been witches and midwives. With the extermination of witches and midwives, antenatal care and obstetrics were increasingly transferred to men and eventually became their domain. Women were completely pushed out of this activity or relegated to subordinate auxiliary services. The men, however, had not the slightest idea of the natural functions of female sexuality, of pregnancy and birth, and now tried to reduce their deficit by dissecting female bodies. It is understandable that, as a result of this type of medicine, diseases first became more frequent. G. Complications at the puerperium due to unsterile cutting during birth, and that the sterilization of medical instruments, on the other hand, represented a major advance. However, as long as pregnancy and birth had been cared for by the witches, midwives with their completely different understanding of female functions, the support of natural self-regulation of the female body as well as the application of life-energetic healing methods and other natural remedies, such complications could hardly have occurred. But once the natural self-regulation is destroyed, even its destroyer can still offer itself as a great savior and helper, because the victim is ultimately dependent on its help and is also grateful for it. So it seems to be a false myth that modern medicine has been one of the main causes of the population explosion by reducing infant and child mortality and increasing average life expectancy. But even if medicine had been effective in this way, this would not have automatically resulted in population growth if women had continued to have the means of natural contraception and conscious child planning. However, after this knowledge had been taken away from them in the course of the witch hunt and a sexually hostile morality had been enforced, they were deprived of these possibilities.
Witch persecution and population development.
The result of this targeted strategy of church and state to increase human production was not long in coming. Although the witch hunt led to millions of victims among the women, it also drove the average number of children of the surviving women so high that an exponential population growth was initiated. So this is where the historical roots lie. This is where the population explosion began, and not, at least not primarily, in the achievements of modern medicine. The ruling classes in Europe were initially only pleased with this development because the sources of exploitation were once again abundant, and their wealth was thus increased. For the nobility, an increase in the number of peasants in bondage, and a renewed increase in the additional product they earned and were forced to pay. For the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, an increase in the number of wage earners, and thus the coverage of the growing demand for labor or the need for soldiers for the upcoming conquest campaigns of colonialism. A certain surplus of labor was also in their interest because it pushed down wages and thus increased profits. However, with the development of capitalism, the population development in Europe went beyond the original goal of the ruling classes. In connection with the original accumulation and uprooting of masses of people from their previous livelihoods, there was such overpopulation in relation to jobs that the problems of social misery were eradicated by force, with the aforementioned mass murders of unemployed people who wanted to ensure their survival as beggars, thieves, or vagabonds. However, anti-sexual morality and the destruction of contraceptive knowledge were now so deeply rooted in society that, despite overpopulation in early capitalism and high capitalism, there were not any substantial sexual reforms until the mid-20th century. On the other hand, the overpressure of population growth forced waves of emigration to the rest of the world, which had to be discovered and conquered. In this way, many escaped the threat of hunger and violence in Europe and found a new perspective on life. In this respect, the distant countries were no longer only interesting for trade, but also as settlement areas for European emigrants. From this point of view, colonialism was also an outlet for solving the pressure of problems in capitalist Europe. Since human beings of other races, cultures and skin colors lived in these countries, an ideology of domination was needed that justified subjugating, exploiting these human beings, and to break their resistance with force if necessary. Only the whites from Europe were considered human beings. The others were subhumans, comparable to animals that had to be subjugated or slaughtered. The Church gave its blessing to all the genocides and enslavement, to all the destruction of foreign cultures, traditions, and religions, and sent its missionaries out into the world to pave the way for colonization and to provide ideological security. By destroying still existing natural religions and sex-affirming ways of life, which were fought against as pagan and immoral, she also destroyed the still existing knowledge and the willingness and ability for conscious child planning. the Pope still travels to the Third World and declares contraception a cardinal sin. This is not the first time that the Catholic Church is complicit in unbelievable human misery, and consoles its faithful to a better hereafter, if they only believe in the God of the Church and submit to their fate. Like other patriarchal religions that emerged in the last 6,000 years after the origin of violence, the faith of the Roman Catholic Church is also deeply masochistic. Suffering and submission instead of lust, joy of life and self-confident development. Instead of perceiving and allowing the divine figu note, the creative in oneself and in nature, to flow as sexuality and creativity and to feel connected to all living and loving in the same cosmic life energy. In the patriarchal and sex-hostile religions, the divine is buried in one's own body and split off and projected into the hereafter as a punishing God to whom one must submit. The spirituality of witches and other natural religions, which included a direct sensual experience of the divine in one's own body, had to be destroyed by the Church for this reason. The trust in one's own power, the sensual experience of the healing and loving power of the life energy in oneself, in connection with other human beings and nature as a whole, made any belief in a God in the hereafter or in his supposed representatives on earth obsolete.
On 15.03 10. 1806 Andrei Stepanovsk wrote under O. Stepanovsky at CZ.
Dear Professor Senf, I would like to ask your permission to publish the chapter Historical Roots of the Population Explosion from your book The Rediscovery of the Living in Our Figu Bulletin. You can offer this chapter free of charge in PDF format on your website. The Figu Bulletin is a service of Figu Free Interest Group for Frontier and Humanities and Ufological Studies, which is published free of charge on the Figu website http://www.figu.org in PDF format, sporadically according to demand and according to available material. A few hundred copies are also printed as staple sheets and sent to passive members of Figu or to interested parties. We would of course include all references to your persons, your website, and your book in the chapter, and publish it in unchanged form.
Only we would like to make one single remark regarding the term the divine which you use.
Which is as follows. Instead of perceiving and letting the divine Figu note, the creation in oneself and in nature flow as sexuality and creativity and feeling connected to all living and loving in the same cosmic life energy.
In patriarchal and sex-hostile religions, the divine is buried in one's own body and is split off and projected into the beyond as a punishing God to whom one has to submit.
As Figu has been dealing intensively with the explosive topic of overpopulation since 1975, we would be extremely pleased to publish your chapter in our bulletin, as we are enthusiastic about it, and some of us will certainly look for your book or study your other valuable work concerning economy, etc. I look forward to your reply, Andrei Stepanovsky, Figu passive member. Item prime Reintar.
Senf, Monday, the 15th of March, 2010, 2046 Subject, Request to publish a chapter of your book.
Dear Mr. Stepanovsky, I agree with the publication you plan to make according to your attached letter in the Figu Bulletin. With kind regards, Bernd Senf.
Senf, Monday, the 15th of March, 2010, 2056 Subject, Request to publish a chapter of your book.
Dear Mr. Senf, thank you very much for your affirmative answer. After the bulletin with your chapter has been published, I will send it to you by email as an attachment. If you do not wish to receive it, you can tell me. Good luck in your work, Andrei Stepanovsky.
I think the letter and the article are good. Both topics should be raised and spread more, because they present things the way they really are. You should also publish both in a bulletin.
That is also what I have in mind. Yes, Mr. Senf has given us permission to publish his article in a bulletin. But see here, this is the version that we want to put in front of all translated books and brochures. What do you think?
Ptah reads,
Essential requirement for understanding this writing before reading the contents of the book respectively brochure. The following text is to be studied thoroughly and carefully.
On the basis of our own painstaking and nerve-wracking experiences in translating the Goblet of the Truth into English, it has been finally proven that a comprehensively correct and faithful translation of our doctrinal writings from German into another earthly language is impossible. Since our Pleiaren friends have come to the same conclusion, on the basis of their own investigations by their linguists, FIGU Switzerland Mother Center does not translate any other books into foreign languages except the Goblet of the Truth. We concentrate on the preservation and distribution of the original texts. We do not take responsibility for the misunderstandings and mistranslations that inevitably arise from translations. However, we, Billy Eduard A. Meier, Billy Eduard Albert Meier, and FIGU Switzerland do allow translations of our books and small type into foreign languages. The following conditions must be observed. If a person or a group wants to translate a book or a text with the intention of a publication in printed or electronic form, they must first clarify the situation with FIGU Switzerland. The copyright and the license of a work remain in any case unrestricted with Billy Edward Albert Meier or FIGU Switzerland. Before a translation, a written permission must be obtained from Billy Eduard Albert Meier or FIGU Switzerland, and depending on the case, a contract must be concluded. The translation must be done directly from the original German text. The persons or grouping concerned is responsible for ensuring the best possible translation. FIGU Switzerland does not guarantee and is not responsible for the correctness of the translations, because it is impossible to translate the German language correctly into other languages. The name of the translator must be attached to each translation. If there is not yet a study or national group in a country, it is useful and desirable to publish the address of the translator as well. Texts which are only published in electronic form must be made available free of charge to any existing FIGU subsidiary group study or national group in the country concerned. The latter will make the text available in 2 languages on the Internet and will immediately make any corrections to the document in question. If there is not yet a study or national group in the country concerned, the translated text will be published on the website of the FIGU Mother Center for the country concerned. In the case of coded humanities texts, except contact reports and novels, the original German text must be printed as a means of comparison. This text is to precede every book or brochure bilingually as an introduction. It is also to be considered that a code is woven into the German texts of Billy Eduard Albert Meier. This code is only fully effective if every word from the beginning to the end of the text is in its correct place and written without errors. The code releases impulses from the memory bank area which hit the reader and begin to take effect in him. This process is unconscious and has nothing to do with coercion or manipulation, but only with the knowledge that is stored in the memory banks for all times and that very slowly begins to penetrate consciousness again when triggered by corresponding impulses. This effect also occurs when someone reads the German text who is not fluent in the German language. It is not important whether the text is spoken softly or loudly or only read. The German language originates from the Old Lyranian, and interestingly enough, it has exactly the same number of letters per word. Example, Sahlomi Gamnan Ben Urda. Peace be upon the earth. It is not possible for Billy Edgeworth Albert Meier to include the code in a language other than German, because no other language is suitable for code recording. In addition, it must be taken into account that many words and terms of the German language do not exist in other languages, which is why all foreign language translations can only incompletely reproduce the meaning of the German original. Figu, Switzerland, February 2010.
The whole thing makes sense, just like we talked about. So I can agree to that.
Then we can let everything run like this, which is good. But now I have something on my stomach that I want to talk to you about. It is about the contract I made with Michael Horn and Jack Gerlach regarding the sale of merchandise in a Billy shop in the USA. The two of us talked about this contract and about my rights in relation to it on the 1st of March. You then clarified the facts. I did not want to raise this matter until this evening at the meeting, because I wanted to fetch the report of the meeting first so that I could read it out. Unfortunately, things went wrong when Jose Barreto became involved, because this enthusiast interfered in a very negative way when he heard about the matter on the internet. Unfortunately, this then spread to the members of Figu Siai, and as a result, unpleasantness arose. I am very embarrassed about what happened, and it is painful for me, which is why I also want to discuss and clarify this matter at the meeting this evening. But there is also another thing that I want to bring up and clarify before the group. It concerns interference in private matters concerning Hans Georg, which is based on telephone calls from outside and observations by people foreign to Figu Chi, but which has also made waves in the core group and the passive group. These are things that are not the business of Figu members or strangers. The thing is,
the whole thing really corresponds to a private matter that only concerns Hans Georg and must also remain his business, just as you say. It is not acceptable that someone interferes in his private affairs. And so, in this respect, I am glad that you are taking care of the matter at your own discretion and that you are clarifying everything. The second matter which you also mentioned does indeed require your intervention in order to clarify everything. And I have no doubt that you know how to handle the whole of these two matters correctly. However, it is still necessary for me to follow the matter at your meeting tonight, where Florina and Injana will also be present. We will record everything and later discuss what has been recorded with all those who work with us. Afterwards, I will visit you again next week to inform you of our findings.
good, but I will not say anything about that. Only be careful to say that all talking should be done deliberately and correctly.
That is your decision, but I think it is correct. But now, my friend, I still have some work to do with Florina and Injana, after which I will follow and record your conversations together with them in the evening at your meeting. After that, we will meet again next week, when we have all made up our minds about everything, and I can bring you the results.